In this video, we're going to be taking a look at some best practices for getting our skeletal mesh exported out from Maya and put that into a game engine like Unreal Engine 4. So let's go ahead and get started. We're here in Maya 2016. Should be very similar even if you have an earlier version of Maya. But you can see this particular creature that I have here. If I put this at 0, you can see this is the animation that it has on it. I'm going to put this at -100 right here, and I'm going to get back to an area where I've got a bind pose for this thing. So the bind pose is the position of the skeleton whenever we initially took all of our geometry and actually bound it to these different joints. And that's pretty important for us to export that thing out and get that into Unreal as just this mesh with the skeleton, and everything's got that information kind of this neutral state. Because I have a rig that I built on this with these different controls, and those this rig actually drives the bones, I'm going to have to disable the joints getting the information from that rig. So I can go under modify, and you can see there's this evaluate nodes, and I can tell it to ignore all. And at that point, it's going to ignore basically the constraints that I set up on here with this rig. And then I can select just any one of the bones on here. And then we can go into rigging, or I think the older version of Maya was under animation. On this one, it's going to be on rigging. And then we go under skin, and then we go to bind pose. And you can see this is the pose of the mesh with the skeleton when we initially bound everything. So again, this is pretty important to kick out this state. The other thing I want to talk to you about is making sure that we're exporting the same things every single time we export to Unreal Engine 4. So I've created a selection set that has basically all the different bones that I'm going to need to export out, and then also all the different pieces of geometry. So this selection set's pretty easy to make. I can just go to the skeleton, and I made a group for animation, and then another group called skeleton within there. I'll just hit hold down shift and click this button here to expand everything, and I want to select all the different joints in here. So I'm going to just hold down shift and then select in to the very bottom that I see of these joints. Now I don't want any of the information that I had for a rig, so if you do have a rig in there, make sure you're going through and then identifying anything that's not a joint. So you can see that this little icon on here, these are the icons for joints, and then if you see anything else different from that, constraints or stuff like that, I'm going to hold down control and deselect these things here like this, and I'm just going to keep going through and deselect any of my constraints that I have and any of these effectors which are used for the inverse kinematics on here, the IK. So there's all my different joints that I have, and then I would need to select all the different geometry that I would be exporting out. So I'm going to open this up as well, and I'll hold down control and just keep adding to this selection that you see here. So here's all the different pieces that I need, and this is basically what I'm going to export out every time. So we can go under create and then go to sets, and we could do a quick selection set, but I don't think it's much faster than even going up here and going to sets and then going to the option box. So we'll do this, and we can give it a name, and we can scroll down here and let's see what the name is that I gave before. So I just call this Dino UDK export. So this is Dino UE4. Let's try that export, just so we have a different name, and I'll hit apply, and now I can deselect this thing, and you can see that it's made this new selection set in the outliner. So if you don't see the outliner, again, that's under Windows and then go to outliner, and that's going to open this thing up here. So if you expand this thing, you can see all the different pieces that are in it like this, and if you need to select the pieces for export, when you save your scene, this is going to save with it, and you just select this thing here, right click on it and say select set members, and at that point it's going to select everything that you need for export. So once you get this set up, you're going to be able to make sure that every time you export from Maya that you've got this thing set up in a way to where you know it's going to be the same every single time. So once we've got everything selected, we're going to go to File, Export Selection option box. Make sure the FBX exporter is selected as your export type, and then let's just take a look at the presets real quick on this thing. So this is the geometry setup that I've got here: smoothing groups, tangents and binormals, smooth mesh, and this is a default on there. Now, if you want to export out animation, which we want to do, make sure that this is ticked here on this one. We're not going to try to bake out any kind of animation on this for this thing, so I don't want to actually include any of that. I am going to include the deform models, skin, and any blend shapes. We don't have any blend shapes, but you could just leave that thing on. The other thing we can do under embed media, if you want to include the materials with your textures on there, you can actually check this and it'll export that out, and Unreal will actually make a really simple material for you and hook up the different textures. If not, you can turn that off and it'll just export out the different meshes and the skeleton. I guess we'll go ahead and just click this thing and enable it. And after that, you can save the preset if you want. We can just close it after we set everything, and we can just say export selection. So then you're going to want to find an area that you are going to export everything out to. I like to make a folder for everything and keep everything kind of organized. So I made an FBX folder, and I'll just go within here, and then I'll just give this a name. Let's just call this Dino Class Example, like this, and I'll export selection on this thing. And you can see it's going to go through, and off window here, when it's done, it should kick out and give you any kind of errors that it might have, something like that. So I don't think there's anything that I really need to be concerned about. And I do have some animation on here, but we're not really going to be too concerned about that at this point. So I'm going to go ahead and load up Unreal Engine 4, and then we'll take a look at that in Unreal. Alright, here we are inside of Unreal Engine 4, and this is kind of our goal for us to eventually get our character in here and start doing at least some type of idle animation for this. So I'm going to go ahead and stop that. I actually had that on Simulate, so let's say Play in selected viewport, and I'll escape out of here real quick. Alright, so in here I actually made a folder structure for one of the characters for the dinosaurs. So it's pretty easy for you to do that. Might as well just go through that same thing. I'll just select the content folder like this, and we'll say add new, and we can say add new folder right here like this. So I'll just call this Dino Class Example again. And what I was putting in here, again, we can be very organized with our stuff that we're making, so we can keep making new folders, and we'll call this skeletal mesh, maybe skeletal mesh like this. Okay, and we could right click in here and say new folder textures, and maybe a new folder, and make materials like that. Okay, and then the skull mesh folder, I'm going to go here, and I'm going to go and say import. So we're in the skull mesh folder, import, and let's go ahead and navigate to where that asset actually sits. And so I believe, let me navigate to that real quick. Okay, here's the folder structure that I have, and again, this was a Dino Class Example FBX, and let's just go ahead and load that up right here like this. And here's our import options for this. So we're going to import the mesh, import as skeletal mesh. The skeleton, we don't have, we do have one in here already, but that's from something that I was actually creating, so I'm going to leave that on none. I'm not going to import any animations on here, so I'm going to leave that alone. You can see we can expand these things, and there's actually more options that we can update some of these things. So I think everything's good for that on this one, and I'll close this up too. Here's where we can tell it if we want to import materials and textures, and we'll go ahead and check that for both of these. And then this is where if you have a normal map and then you need to invert the normal map, the I believe the green channel on there, this is going to actually invert that for you. We're not using any kind of normal maps right now on this for this setup, so we don't have to worry about that. So I'll go ahead and hit import, and it should import all of the different files that I'll need within here in this particular area. So again, it's going to make a material for us and import the textures. Now I had a bunch of different materials on this this character to kind of break up its different pieces, so that's why it made multiple materials instead of just making one material for this thing. But we can go ahead, after we have these things, you know, imported in, we can select the materials, and I can click and drag this into material area and just say move here, and I can do the same thing for the textures. I'll just tell it to move it here, and I'll leave the rest of this where it sits within the skull mesh area. So it's making also just the skeleton, I believe, for this. Let's double click this and load this up, and it looks like it'll have the character, and this is going to show us all the different joints that they have in here for the skeleton. Now if you need to move the light around, you can hold down L and then click and then drag, but not sure if we're going to need to do some work to the material on this. So let's go ahead and close this up for now, and we'll double click on the actual mesh for this, and then we'll start to look at this. Okay, so here's the different materials that are on there. Again, I assigned different materials inside of Maya, and it'll recognize that. So you can see I can actually highlight and show you what is selected to what area on here. Okay, let's fix up that material real quick. So I'm going to go to the materials, and I can go to this very first one, Dino Mat, and again, it's going to just make something very, very simple. The reason it was shading so dark is I think I was going to feed this into the emissive color. If I fed this into the emissive color like this, it's just going to get pure light on this particular area. So if I hit save on this, I'm going to go ahead and let it save, and then I'll pull this tab out so we can kind of look at this, and we can double click this and open this up. I'll pull this tab out so we can actually start to look at it. So here you go. You can see now that this part is being self-illuminated. Now if I just feed this into the material the way that I did with emissive, it's not going to get any kind of lighting information on it at all. It's only going to be lit purely from the texture. So let me go ahead and click on a flat plane so you can kind of see a little bit better what's going on here. I don't need any specularity or metallic or roughness on this thing, so if I hold down 1 and click, I can get a just a constant like this, and I don't want any metallic, so I'll feed that here for a value of 0. I'll copy and paste that. Specular, I don't want any kind of specular on it, and that should take away the speck that we saw kind of on here. I'll go ahead and hit save, and you can kind of see some of this update a little bit on the mesh right in through here. The other thing is we need, because we have transparency, we want to change the material type. So I'll just click here, and right now it's on a blend mode of opaque, and we can put this on masked. Masked is just going to take the alpha that we have, and it's going to draw the transparency either on or off. So we can take the alpha and go to opacity mask like this, and it should knock out the background on here. So now you can see through on this thing. I'll go ahead and hit save for that, and you should see all this update, and it's going to get rid of all this kind of this part of the polygons that you see here, at least on this part that we have. Now this isn't full transparency. The reason I'm using this method currently with this version of Unreal Engine, which is 4.7, They don't have full transparency sorting within an object like this. So you can see this is all the different pieces have been combined into one object inside of Unreal Engine with a skeleton on it, and so it's seen as like a 3D model. Now I need this leg to draw in front of the body, and the body needs to draw in front of those back legs. Currently, there's a problem with the sorting order if we change this material type from mask to translucent. Translucent will give you full transparency, but you'll see what's going to happen here. I'll pipe this into opacity now at this point, and I'll go ahead and hit save. And I believe we're going to have an issue with some of the sorting. At least this will show up whenever I assign this material to the different sections on the body. But let's let this finish through so you can see this here. So that's actually drawing okay. You can see the tongue is starting to show through on here, so you can see that it's starting to get some problems. If I take this material, this one that we're working on, and I pipe them into each one of these slots, you're really going to be able to see the different problems. So here we go. This is what we're trying to avoid. And so again, currently I'm hoping that this is going to change in the future. So if you're watching this in a future video and you're able to use that material type, then that's awesome. But currently we're going to have to come here and make sure that we're not on translucent but masked. I'm going to guess the reason why this works is whenever it uses this masked, it treats it almost as if these are just polygons, and it's just kind of sorting them without any kind of transparency. I know there is transparency in there, so maybe that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but it's just definitely a different type of rendering mode. So now you can see everything's kind of working correctly for us on there. The other thing we could do is we could say roughness. If we want to give this a roughness value, I'm going to copy and paste. We could give it a value of 1, because a value of 1 for roughness means there is it's more like a value of 0 for roughness would be glass, and the value I'm sorry, I need to put this at 1. So a value of 1 would be like something like glass, and then a value of 1 would be something that's very, very matte, even higher than something like carpet or something like that. Obviously it depends on what type of carpet we're talking about, but I think you understand something that's very, very matte and doesn't have very much specularity to it. So again, if we wanted any kind of shading on this thing, we would have to kind of lessen the amount of emissive that's being fed into here. So currently it's 100% being driven by that map, even though we have something piped into base color that gets overridden by this emissive. We could hold down M and do a multiply on here, and we could drag out the color to this multiply, and then we could push this to the out of that to emissive, like this. Now if we do that, if we multiply by 1, any number multiplied by 1 is going to give you the same result back, that's just a value of 1. Now if we want to darken this thing, we can give it a value of 0.5, and it's going to lessen that amount of emissive on here for this texture. So we hit save, we can see that being pushed out on here, and at that point it's getting 50% of the texture is being pushed to the emissive at that point. And so you saw this kind of darken up a little bit, and now if I hold down L in here and move the light around, there should be some sort of interaction with the lighting on here. Now if we want to make this even less, like this, we can go to something like 0.25, somewhere in there. And once that's done, I'll go ahead and hit save for this, and you should see it pushed over here to these other pieces. It's almost done cooking that. So you can see it got a lot darker at that point. But now you can see this is starting to be affected by the light. And this is kind of what I'm hoping for. I want this thing to receive some shadow information, and I want the lights to actually affect it. Again, I'm just holding down L and then clicking and dragging, but it took a while to find the position of that light where I was kind of happy with this, where I can see some kind of shadow information on this thing like this. And you can see within our materials, each one of these slots, we're telling it to cast a shadow. We can turn those on and off if you want. So if you didn't want it to cast a shadow, you're able to turn those off for the materials in there. But I think that's going to be good right now for what we're trying to do with the materials setup on this. Okay, so I'm going to close this thing down, and if you have anything that needs to be saved, you can see that it's going to have this little asterisk sign over it. So we can just right click and say save, and then I'll save these different pieces like this. I'll save this out, and now we can click and drag this out into the world, and you could even check it in the world. So if you need to scale that thing up, it's pretty simple. You just hit the space bar, and we could scale that thing up like this here. If I checked one of these, I could see maybe with the original scale, I put this at 1.5. So you can individually change scale on this if you wanted to stretch something out. You can see I'm spreading out the amount that's going in through here, or you could do something like this and stretch it out. But I'm going to leave this at 1.25, and then I'm going to lock this to where if I change one value, it'll change everything. So I want to go 1.5, and then now I've got this at the same scale as everything else in the game. So I'm going to just take this and I'll push him right over here like this, and then just go and play in the game real quick and then walk past this. Now the reason that this is changing the camera like this is because the camera is actually running into this new creature that I put in here. So if you don't want the camera to collide with this, there is a collision area, and we can take this and we can tell it no collision like this, and I think the camera might still run into that thing. No, it's actually not going to. Okay, so that's actually good. I don't want the camera to be changed by something that's up here in the foreground like this. So that's at least the initial step of getting our work into Unreal Engine 4. Now if we wanted to pull in an animation for this, the setup for that's a little bit different. So we're going to need to hop back on over to Maya and take a look at exporting out some animation. Alright, here we are back inside of Maya, and some of the things that we need to talk about is making sure that our animation timeline is set. So this was my negative frames. I do need to enable my rig again, so I'm going to go to modify, and I'm going to say evaluate nodes and then say evaluate all, and you can see my rig begins to work again. So again, I have this rig on here, and the rig is driving the skeleton, these different joints on here. So I've got to show you basically how to get the animation that is on these joints that's being driven by the rig to where it's just got keyframe data on the joints, because that's what Unreal is going to read for us. So I'm going to put this at frame 0 like this. This is the beginning of this animation here, and I can check this and make sure that everything kind of loops through. So I can come to the end here and everything kind of loops through, and everything's kind of good. Everything's good for this animation. And now I'm going to drag this thing on the way back, and I need to select all the joints that I want to bake out the animation for. So I'm going to open up my animation area. I could go through and select all the joints, but if you remember the selection set that we made, it would be easier for me to open that thing and then just go select the top joint here, hold down Shift, and select all the joints that I need. So that makes life a little bit easier for us. And we are going to change to this menu here under animation. Again, I believe this is an earlier version. I think you would just be an animation for this. I I think they actually moved this before. It might have been under modify. There was a place for setting keys, but they've actually moved this over to a whole another menu set called key, and there's this bake animation. So we're going to be able to go to bake animation, go to the option box like this, and we're going to be able to say hierarchy selected. This is what we have selected for the different joints, and in the channel box we could say all keyable, which would say everything that's keyable over here: visibility, translation, rotation, scale. And so we could do that. The time range we can set from the time slider, or you could say a very specific range if you wanted to say a start and end time. You can see this is going to start from frame 0 and end at frame 10, but we can just do the time slider here. This is going to say if you want to bake this to a new animation layer, you can make a new animation layer. In my case, I'm blending multiple animations together in this area here, and so I'm probably going to want to make a new layer for myself, and I'm going to say baked layers keep. I'm just going to sample this by one keyframe every frame, and I'm going to go ahead and hit apply. And so it's going to go through and bake everything out for me like this. And when we're done, the real test is to see, like, if I have something like a rig, I can check the joints. That's one thing that I can do. So you can see here's these baked results that was in the animation layer. If you're not using them, you wouldn't even really need to be worrying about this, but it's just something that that I have on here. So a test that I could do is just to go through and I could take my rig that I have and I could just delete the thing, and if my animation still plays, then we're all good. For that, I can select the different joints, and you can see that there is now a keyframe on every single frame for all these different joints that we have. Okay, so now it's time for us to export this thing out. So again, this holds true if you had anything like morph targets or anything like that. You would need to actually bake out the keys for this to make sure that it's actually playing correctly. So I can go here and say click and right click over this and say select our set members, and I'm going to say export selection. This time my presets, I don't need this embed media. I really don't need that. The only thing I want is animation. Now I've never really gotten this bake animation to actually work. It'd be great if this did work, but I haven't seen it working yet. But I could just set this to 0 and to 600. Again, I'm just going to leave it off because I haven't really seen this work all that great. I'm going to go ahead and close this. I'll go ahead and say export selection, and this time under FBX we've got this Dino class example, and I'll call this at the end of it anim, like this, 1. I'll export the selection for that. Okay, and we'll get any kind of warnings that we would get on here, and then we'll go back on over to Unreal Engine 4. And within here, I might as well just make myself a new folder and call this animation, like that. And I'm going to go ahead in here and I'm going to import like this, and then we'll find this class example anim1. And again, we don't want the mesh. We'll just import this as a skeleton, as an animation, and we can select the skeleton now. So when we exported or imported in the last one, we imported in this one called Dino class example skeleton. So we'll select that skeleton like this, and let's just open up miscellaneous and make sure under animation that we're importing this in correctly. So we could say from exported time, we could set a range if you wanted to do that. Let's just try this exported time and see what happens with this one. So I'll go ahead and hit import for this, and I'll go through and it should import these different frames that we have. And then when it's done, we should be able to see it show up in this animation area, and we'll double click on it and take a look at it right there in this spot. So let's just double click on this, take a look, and we should have our little dinosaur character actually animating. And I'm going to take the L key and try to find our light in here. So here we are, somewhere in here, and just gonna watch over it. The thing I'm concerned about is making sure that it loops correctly, and it looks like everything's working all right with that. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and hit save, because if we pull this over, you can see this little asterisk. It just means it needs to be saved. So we'll go ahead and save that, and we'll close this window down like that. And let's find the character that we put into the world. So you can see here, remember we went to our skeletal mesh area and just click and drag this thing out into the world. And I believe if we want to play a very simple animation on here, let's just go to skeletal mesh. I'm going to do a search for animation on here. Okay, so under animation, I'm not sure why I just wasn't finding that in the thing here. Animation mode. So we can tell it to use an animation blueprint, or we can tell it to use an animation asset. And so since we have this animation here, we can click it and just put it on here. And you can see immediately our mesh pops into place like it's going to start animating. And we can tell it to loop. And it's already set to playing, and we can tell it how fast it should play. So if it's set to 1, it's just going to play normal speed, and if you set it to something like 2, it's going to play twice as fast, and if you put it at something like 0.5, it's going to play, half the speed. So let's do this here like this. We'll set this to 1. Let's just go ahead and duplicate this. I want to show you how we can make some different copies in here. So I'm going to hold down Alt under the Move tool here and drag this copy out. We'll pull this guy forward just a little bit, and we'll change his play rate to 0.5, and we'll drag out one more copy. Hold down Alt and click and drag like this, and I'll pull this one just a little bit forward, and this one I'll set to 1.5, something like that. Okay, and we could, if you just want to look at it playing in here without actually playing the game, you could go to simulate and kind of take a look at this. I can deselect this, and so you can see we've got our animation on there and he's playing, and we've got some variation on these guys so that it doesn't look like they are playing the same animation, but they're just playing it at a different rate. And if you speed it up, it doesn't look too bad. If we play it in pretty slow like this, it looks like he's just kind of stuck in slow motion mode. I'll go ahead and hit stop, and we could also go into play selected viewport. I can hit F11 like this, and if I can hit Shift F11, that's going to hide the Windows bar at the very bottom of here. So I'm just going to take the character and move him around, and you can actually see how this art is actually kind of looking and updating. So you saw here the tongue actually intersected with the character in front, I think, some problem like that. So you definitely need to make sure you're getting any art that you're doing like this away from each other. But you can see now everything is everything's functional. Everything's kind of working, at least from a standpoint of we've got our character in and we've got an animation in. So the examples that I have back here, I'm doing something a bit more complicated. I'll just talk to you real quick about it. I've made some different blueprints on here, so I'll go ahead and double click this blueprint and open it up, and we can see some of the structure. Let me just get this into view here like this. I'll hold down L and rotate the light around so it makes a little bit more sense. So let's go talk about the event graph. This thing doesn't actually even matter. It's just kind of sitting over here. I can get rid of this and then just recompile that. But we've got this event blueprint update animation. I've made a delay, and again, you can find all these just by right-clicking. And if you're having trouble finding it, you might actually take off context sensitive. So if we do update, maybe animation, let's just type in that and we've got an event blueprint update animation right here like this, so that would create this node here, and we've got a delay, so we can just type in delay right here like that, and you're able to give it a duration, which would be, I set it to 15 seconds. And then we've got this thing for making a random integer like this, and let's just type in int for random integer, and I'm making a random integer between 4 different values, and because of what's going on in here is I've got 4 different animations, so I need a random number to play these different animations. So made a custom variable and did that over here in the anim graph. You can see under variables you can make a new one here, and this variable type was set to green, so it was just an integer, so it's just giving you a number like that. I don't actually need that, I just wanted to show you how it was created, so I'll hit delete for that. And I gave it a name of current animation like this. So once this is set, you can drag this out like this, and you can tell it to either get or set, and I'm telling it to set because this update blueprint animation thing goes through the delay, gets this random integer, and then it sets the value for this. Okay, so this is the setup in the event graph just to set up that random integer. Then over in the anim graph, we've got that current animation. Instead of setting it, we're going to get it. So we're going to get the value of that thing, and then we're plugging that into blend poses by integer, by a number. So let's just say blend poses by integer. So you can see that here is going to be this thing, and we would go ahead and take the current animation, go ahead and pipe that into the active child index like you can see here. So that's going to give that random number and plug it into this area. If we just right click over this node, we can say add blend pen, and you can see we're going to have a blend pose 0 and 1. So here's where we're going to be able to pipe in different animations. So depending on how many you have, in my case I had 4 different animations within here, so I would say add blend pen and keep doing that until I had all the different slots that I needed for the animation. So at that point, it's just a matter of clicking and dragging it out to hook these different pieces up like this, and you would pipe the result of this out from here into the result of this final animation pose that you see here. So the last thing you might be wondering is how to actually get these animations to show up within here. If we just go ahead and right click on here, and then if we say play, and I'll do anim like this, it should give you a list of the different animations that are available for this particular mesh with the skeleton. Now I don't have the new one that we just imported in because this is a blueprint for some things that I was working on before, but the animation should show up in through here, and it would be just a matter of taking this here and then going through and then hooking things up just like what we looked at before. This setup is definitely a lot more complicated than what we originally took a look at, where we're just putting an animation in and basically getting something to play. So if you are interested in exploring some of these more difficult concepts for getting like a blueprint to play, this should be enough to get you kind of started, so you can kind of play around with how you would take your different animations and blend them together.